The first thing you noticed, driving County Road J outside Plainview, Minnesota, on a gray March morning, was the smell. Sweetish, sour, wrong. The second thing you noticed was the color. A milky white stain running down the ditch grass for almost 60 yards, frozen in ripples where it had frozen and thawed and frozen again. Somebody had been dumping milk there, not once, for months. The stain had layers to it, like tree rings, and where the county mower had cut the grass the summer before, you could see the old white crust still clinging to the stalks underneath. And nobody driving past could explain why anyone would waste that much milk, again and again, in the same spot, for a year. The answer, when people finally got it, was almost boring. A processing plant 20 minutes down the highway rejected loads that came in over their acidity threshold or with an antibiotic flag from a random screening, and rather than pay to haul the rejected milk somewhere for proper disposal, the driver, a subcontracted hauler, not even a plant employee, had been quietly dumping it in the ditch behind the old Halverson dairy barn because nobody lived out there anymore to complain. Except somebody did. Her name was Renata Kowalczyk, and she'd moved into the falling-down farmhouse 18 months earlier after her divorce, with nothing to her name but a decent settlement check, 2 barn cats she'd adopted out of guilt, and a resume that said 17 years in accounts payable at a company that no longer existed. She was 44. She had grown up 2 counties over, on a dairy farm her parents sold when she was 22, and she had spent the 2 decades since telling herself she was glad to be done with cows and silage and 4 a.m. alarms. Then the marriage ended. The job ended within the same year, almost like the 2 things had been holding each other up, and she found herself back in dairy country with a small check and a big house and absolutely no plan. The dumping had been going on, she later learned, for almost a year by the time she noticed it properly. She'd seen the truck a few times without thinking much of it, a white tanker, unmarked, idling at the field edge. But it was the smell that finally made her walk down there with her coffee one morning and look. She should have been angry. Everyone told her she should be angry. "It's a nuisance," her neighbor Dale Ostrom said. "That's a violation of about 6 different state codes. You ought to report it and sue somebody." And she did report it. The hauling company got fined. The dumping stopped within 2 weeks. But before it stopped, she did something nobody expected. She started walking down there with a bucket. She wasn't sure why, at first. Maybe because the milk was the only interesting thing that had happened to her in a year. Maybe because some old muscle memory from her father's dairy, the smell of a full bulk tank, the particular sourness of milk gone past its window, made her curious instead of disgusted. She scooped some of the freshest of it, the stuff that hadn't fully frozen, into a mason jar, brought it inside, and just watched it. Over 2 days on her counter it thickened, separated, curdled on its own, clabbered, her grandmother would have called it. She remembered, distantly, that this was the beginning of cheese. Not good cheese, not safe cheese, not anything you'd want to eat off a dumped, unrefrigerated tanker load, but it was the first time in a year she'd been curious about anything, and curiosity, it turned out, was a thing she badly needed. She did not, to be clear, start her cheese business on dumped ditch milk. That part matters, and she'd tell you so herself if you asked. Nobody eats cheese made from milk that sat in a Minnesota ditch. What the ditch gave her wasn't the ingredient, it was the question. If milk goes bad this easily, this fast, what does it actually take to make it go right? She started reading. She bought 2 gallons of good milk from the grocery store and a packet of rennet tablets meant for home cheesemaking kits, and she ruined her first 4 attempts in ways that taught her, slowly, what the plant 20 minutes away already knew by instinct. The first batch she rushed. She'd read that you add rennet and wait for a clean break, the point where the curd, when you slide a knife into it, splits cleanly instead of tearing like scrambled eggs. And she didn't wait long enough. Impatience. She cut the curd at 20 minutes instead of the 45 it needed, and the result was a mush that never firmed, because the curd matrix hadn't finished setting, and cutting it early released moisture unevenly, and left her with something between yogurt and glue. She threw it out. The second batch, she waited too long on purpose, overcorrecting, and got acid development she didn't understand at all. She hadn't accounted for the fact that the starter culture, the live bacteria that eat lactose and produce lactic acid, lowering the pH and telling the milk when it's ready, was working the whole time, regardless of whether she was watching the clock or the curd. Left too long, the culture drove the acidity too far, too fast, and by the time she pressed the curd, it was crumbly and sour in a flat, one-note way, nothing like the rounded tang she was after. She learned, from that mistake, that cheesemaking isn't really governed by the clock on the wall. It's governed by pH, and a clock is only a rough proxy for it. She bought a pH meter after that. It cost more than she wanted to spend, but it was the single best purchase she made that year. The third failure was mold, not the good kind. She'd gotten far enough to actually age a wheel, a small 2-pound wheel of something meant to be a basic tom, down in her unheated cellar, and came back 3 weeks later to find it covered in a fuzzy black-green growth that had nothing to do with the white or blue molds cheesemakers cultivate on purpose. Her cellar's humidity was wrong, too damp, not enough air movement, and she hadn't been wiping the rind down or turning the wheel the way aging actually requires. A cheese cave, she learned, isn't just a cold room. It needs controlled humidity, usually somewhere around 85 to 95% depending on the style, and airflow to keep unwanted mold spores from settling and colonizing. And the rind has to be turned and often brined or washed on a schedule so that one side doesn't stay wet against the shelf and rot from underneath. She'd been letting hers sit still on a wire rack in a root cellar that used to store potatoes, and the potatoes, it turned out, had left their own mold spores behind in the walls. The fourth failure came almost a year in, once she'd gotten good enough to think about selling, and it was the one that actually got her some help. She'd made 8 wheels of a washed curd style, cheddar adjacent, and taken 2 of them to a small cheese shop in Winona, hoping for an order. The shop owner, a soft-spoken woman named Bev Asgard, cut into one, tasted it, and told her plainly that the texture was crumbly and dry, rather than smooth, and the moisture wasn't consistent wheel to wheel. Renata hadn't been controlling her cook temperature closely enough, the step where, after cutting the curd, you slowly heat it while stirring to firm it up and expel whey, and a few degrees difference, batch to batch, held for different lengths of time, gave her wildly different final moisture. Bev didn't buy the cheese, but she did give her a name. "You want Elmer Tesh," she said. "He ran the plant in Fountain City for 30 years before his hands went. He doesn't talk much, and he'll tell you your cheese is bad to your face, but nobody in 3 counties knows more than that man." Elmer Tesh was 78, widowed, and living alone in a house that still smelled faintly of the cheese plant he hadn't set foot in for a decade, because rheumatoid arthritis had taken his hands to the point where he couldn't hold a cheese knife steady anymore. He'd run a small Wisconsin cheddar and Colby operation for most of his working life, the kind that supplied local grocery stores and a handful of restaurants, and when the operation got bought out and modernized in the 90s, he'd stayed on as plant manager until his joints wouldn't let him anymore. He did not want visitors. Bev had to call ahead twice. He let Renata bring him a wedge of her latest attempt, the one Bev had rejected, and he cut it with a knife she'd brought, since his grip wasn't steady enough to trust with his own good ones anymore, and he chewed slowly and looked out the window while he did it. "Your milk's fine," he said finally. "Your hands aren't listening yet." She asked him what that meant. He didn't elaborate much that first visit, but over the following months, in short visits that rarely lasted more than 40 minutes, because that was about as long as he had patience for, he gave her the pieces one at a time, gruffly, like a man dispensing medicine he didn't fully believe would help. He told her that cheese is not a recipe, it's a conversation between 4 things: the milk, the culture, the temperature, and the time, and that if you hold one steady, the others will tell you what's happening if you pay attention. He told her to stop trusting her stopwatch and start trusting her hands, the way the curd felt when she pressed it, the way whey looked when it ran clear versus cloudy. He told her, the day she brought him a wheel with a lopsided sunken side, that a cheese remembers every mistake you make with it, it just waits a few weeks to tell you. That line, a cheese remembers every mistake, it just waits a few weeks to tell you, she didn't fully understand until months later, when a batch she'd been proud of at pressing, firm and clean cut, came out of 6 weeks of aging with an off, ammonia-sharp smell and a slimy rind, because she'd washed the rind with a brine solution that was too weak, letting the wrong bacteria take hold slowly, invisibly, for weeks before it showed. Elmer's sentence, which had sounded like a piece of folksy nothing the first time, turned out to be the most literally true thing anyone had told her. Elmer also gave her the number that mattered most, the one she wrote on a card and taped inside her cave door. Milk for cheese has to be treated cold and fast. Raw milk starts changing the moment it leaves the cow, bacteria multiplying, enzymes breaking down proteins and fat, and every hour it sits above about 40 degrees before you either pasteurize it or start your culture is an hour working against you. It was, she realized, the exact opposite lesson of the ditch. The ditch milk had been left warm, in the open, for as long as a tanker sat there before someone finally dumped it, festering into something closer to poison than food. Good cheese was the ditch's mirror image. The same milk, the same bacteria, doing the same basic chemistry, but controlled, timed, and steered on purpose instead of left to rot by neglect. By her second year, she had a real setup, a used bulk tank bought at an equipment auction in Rochester, a proper stainless vat with a steam jacket for controlled heating that she found for $1,100 from a shuttered creamery in Iowa, and a converted grain bin behind the house, insulated and fitted with a small humidifier and a dehumidifier on a timer, that finally gave her a cave holding steady around 90% humidity and 52 degrees. She bought her milk now, properly, from a small Holstein herd 4 miles up the road, belonging to a family named Brecka, paying a premium above the co-op price because she needed milk that hadn't been commingled with a dozen other farms worth and homogenized down to a uniform blandness. Her first sale was almost an accident. She'd taken 4 wheels of a washed rind cheese, something close to a Muenster, to the farmer's market in Winona, mostly because Bev told her to just go stand there and see what happened, and she sold nothing for 2 hours, standing behind a folding table in the July heat, feeling foolish. Then a man buying tomatoes at the next stall asked to taste it, mostly to be polite, and stood there a long moment chewing before he bought 2 wheels outright and asked when she'd be back. He turned out to be the produce buyer for a restaurant in La Crosse, and he mentioned her name to the chef, who came out himself 2 weeks later. The chef, a woman named Priya Sandhu who ran a small farm-to-table place with maybe 40 seats, didn't want the Muenster. She wanted something aged longer, firmer, that could hold up on a cheese board and in a sauce both. Renata spent that fall developing a version closer to a Tom, aged 12 weeks, rubbed with a light brine every few days for the first month, to build a natural rind, and Priya put it on her menu that winter under Renata's own name, Kowalczyk Farmstead, the first time she'd seen her name attached to something she'd made with her own hands since she'd quit doing anyone else's books. The restaurant account held for 8 months before it nearly ended, and that failure taught her the last hard lesson of her early years. Consistency matters more than quality. Priya called her 1 week in a mood Renata hadn't heard before, cold and businesslike, saying the last 3 deliveries had all tasted different, one too sharp, one bland, one with a slightly grainy texture, and that she couldn't put something inconsistent in front of paying customers, no matter how good any single wheel might be. Renata had been experimenting, tweaking her culture blend and her aging time batch to batch, treating every wheel like a new project instead of a repeatable product. Elmer, when she told him, didn't say much beyond, "You don't sell your best cheese, you sell your same cheese." She started keeping a log, milk source, culture amount, cook temperature, pH readings at each stage, aging time, humidity, and forced herself to make the exact same choices every single batch for a solid year before allowing herself to vary anything on purpose. The restaurant order came back and stayed. From there, the growth was slow and specific, each stage only possible because the one before it had actually worked and given her the volume, the reputation, or the cash to support the next. The restaurant account gave her steady income and, more valuably, Priya's endorsement, which got her into a regional food distributor that supplied small groceries and co-ops across 3 states, a company called Bluff Country Provisions, which required her to pass a food safety inspection, get her cave and vat certified by the state dairy division, and commit to producing at least 60 wheels a month, a scale she'd never attempted. That scaling itself became its own failure. Her first attempt to double her batch size using the same vat produced curd that cut unevenly, because the larger volume of milk took longer to heat through and the top layer overcooked relative to the bottom, giving her a wheel with 2 different textures inside it. She had to slow her heating rate and stir more frequently to compensate, something Elmer had warned her about in an offhand way months earlier that she hadn't understood until she lived it. Bigger vats forgive you less, not more. By her 4th year, Kowalczyk farmstead cheese. By then she had 3 regular styles, the Tom, a cave-aged cheddar, and a washed rind she'd named after the road she lived on, was showing up in small groceries from Duluth down to Dubuque, and she'd hired her first employee, a 19-year-old named Casey Torkelson, from 2 farms over, who wanted to learn the trade the way Renata had, from nothing. Dale Ostrom, the same neighbor who'd told her to sue somebody over the dumped milk, ended up hauling her whey byproduct to his hogs, who did well fattening on it, and the Brecke family, whose milk she bought, added 6 more cows specifically to keep up with her orders, turning what had been a marginal little herd into a stable, growing operation of their own. Elmer Tesh died the winter she turned 48, in his sleep, in the same house that still smelled like the plant he'd run for 30 years. She went to the funeral, and afterward, sorting through what people said about him, she realized how many of his short sentences had been doing double duty the whole time, landing once as something almost too plain to bother remembering, and landing again, months or years later, at the exact moment she finally needed them. A cheese remembers every mistake you make with it. It just waits a few weeks to tell you. You don't sell your best cheese. You sell your same cheese. Your milk's fine. Your hands aren't listening yet. The dairy plant that had done the original dumping, the one whose contracted hauler had poured a year's worth of rejected milk into her ditch, eventually became one of her suppliers too, in a strange, unplanned turn nobody could have predicted. After the fines and the bad local press, the plant's new operations manager, trying to repair the relationship with the surrounding farms, reached out to Renata directly, offering to sell her their in-spec surplus milk at a fair price whenever their own cheese line was overproducing relative to demand, milk that would otherwise have gone to a lower-value bulk buyer. She said yes, on the condition that she could test every load herself before it went in her vat. It amused her, more than she let on, that the same company whose carelessness had first caught her attention was now one of her paying, tested, respectable milk sources. The old stain in the ditch behind the Halverson barn faded within 2 summers, grown over by new grass, and most people driving County Road J today have no idea anything unusual ever happened there. But every so often, giving someone a tour of the cave, the grain bin, converted, holding rows of wheels turning slowly on their shelves, each one logged, dated, humidity checked twice a day, Renata will walk them down to the ditch first, just to show them where it started, the faint discoloration still visible if you know exactly where to look. She'll tell them about the smell and the color and the year nobody could explain it, and then she'll tell them what she actually learned wasn't about milk gone bad at all. It was about what happens to the exact same thing, treated with attention instead of neglect, tracked instead of ignored, given the 60 days and the 52 degrees and the 90% humidity it needed, instead of a ditch and a Minnesota winter. Same milk, she likes to say. Completely different question asked of it. That, more than any recipe, was the thing Elmer Tesh actually taught her, and the thing, in the end, that turned a ditch full of waste into cheese that, 3 years running now, has placed at the American Cheese Society's national competition, sitting on shelves in 11 states, still made 4 miles from the ditch, where the question first got asked. There were details Renata left out of the short version she gave to visitors, the ones that didn't fit into a 5-minute walk down to the ditch and back, but that she'd tell Casey Torkelson, slowly, over the 2 years she spent training her, because Casey was the kind of student who wanted the whole shape of a mistake, not just the warning. She told her about the first time she tried to scale the Tom recipe up to a 100-pound batch, 3 years into the business, when the distributor order jumped from 60 wheels a month to 90 almost overnight because a chain of co-ops in Iowa had picked her up. She'd assumed, wrongly, that doubling everything proportionally, culture, rennet, salt, would just give her double the cheese. It didn't. The culture, a mesophilic blend that needed a certain window of time to acidify the milk before renneting, worked at a different pace in a bigger vat because the heat transfer through a larger stainless mass moved slower, and by the time the top layer of milk had reached the right temperature and pH, the bottom layer had already overshot it by several degrees, held for several extra minutes. The result was a wheel with a chalky rim an inch deep around a softer, wetter core, 2 different cheeses stacked inside the same rind. She'd had to throw out 11 wheels from that single scaling attempt, a loss of nearly $400 in milk alone, not counting the 4 days of aging space they'd occupied for nothing. What fixed it wasn't a bigger vat or a better thermometer. It was patience with the ramp, heating 1 degree every 3 minutes instead of pushing the burner and waiting for the whole tank to catch up, and stirring in a slower, wider figure-8 pattern so the curds moved from bottom to top instead of just being turned over locally near the paddle. Elmer, when she'd described the problem to him over the phone, had laughed for the first time she'd ever heard him laugh, a short, dry sound, and said, "Everybody thinks bigger's just more of the same. It's a different animal every time you go up a size. Ask any auctioneer." She told Casey, too, about the year the price of rennet nearly broke her, when a shortage tied to disruptions overseas. Most commercial rennet in the U.S. still traces back to enzyme suppliers whose raw material chains run through a small number of countries, pushed her cost per gallon of treated milk up almost 30% inside 4 months. She'd briefly considered switching to a vegetable-based coagulant, a thistle or cardoon extract some traditional Portuguese cheesemakers use, mostly to save money, but a trial batch came out with a noticeably bitter finish that built as the cheese aged, a known issue with plant coagulants breaking down proteins less precisely than animal or microbial rennet, releasing bitter peptides over time instead of a clean set. She'd eaten it herself rather than sell it, decided the math didn't work for her particular cheeses, and instead renegotiated her milk price slightly with the Breckes to absorb part of the increase, explaining honestly what was happening, rather than quietly passing all of it onto her buyers and risking the same kind of trust break she'd had with Priya. The American Cheese Society competition entry, the one that finally placed, almost didn't happen at all. Renata had told herself for years that competitions were for operations bigger than hers, outfits with marketing budgets, and someone whose whole job was entering shows, and it was Casey, in her 2nd season working there, who filled out the paperwork without asking and told her afterward instead of before, because she suspected Renata would have said no. They entered the cave-age cheddar, a wheel that had sat 11 months rather than the 9 she usually sold at, one she'd nearly forgotten about in the back corner of the grain bin, behind newer wheels, because it had been part of an experiment in extended aging that she hadn't been sure was worth the shelf space it took up. It placed 2nd in its category the 1st year, 3rd the 2nd year, and 1st the 3rd year, The year a small paragraph about it ran in a regional paper under a headline some editor had clearly enjoyed writing, something about a cheese that started in a ditch, that made Renata wince a little every time someone brought it up, because it flattened 4 years of very specific, very unglamorous work into a single cute image. But she never corrected it too hard, because it wasn't wrong exactly. It just left out the part where getting from the ditch to the ribbon had required a pH meter, a fair number of ruined wheels, a dead man's short sentences, and roughly 1,100 hours of turning cheese by hand in a converted grain bin at a steady 52 degrees. By the time the newspaper story ran, the ditch itself had grown over completely, and the Halverson barn behind it had been re-roofed by the Breckus, who used it now to store the extra hay their expanded herd needed. Dale Ostrom, who still hauled the way out for his hogs twice a week, liked to tell anyone who'd listen that he'd known Renata would make something of herself the day she walked down into that ditch with a mason jar instead of a phone to call a lawyer, though the truth, which he sometimes admitted after a second beer, was that at the time he'd thought she was losing her mind a little and had said so to his wife. Renata didn't disagree with him, looking back. She had been, by any reasonable measure, at loose ends that spring, a woman with a settlement check and no plan, standing in a stinking ditch on a farm she barely knew how to run, scooping up something everyone else had the good sense to be disgusted by. What she'd tell you now, if you sat with her long enough in the cave, turning wheels while she talked, was that the ditch never actually gave her anything, not one usable ounce of milk. What it gave her was a question she hadn't known she needed to ask again. What does it take to do this right? And 4 years, a dead mentor, a ruined cellar, 11 wasted wheels, and 1 nearly lost restaurant account later, she finally had an answer good enough to put her name on.